Hello everyone. So good to be with you again today through this video. Welcome to all of our church members, to the other churches and our network of churches. I hope you're all doing well. I'm praying for you each day. Welcome also to friends and family who are watching this video. Well, 2020 has been some year, hasn't it? Over 200,000 dead globally because of COVID-19. Here in the United States, our economy has taken a terrible hit. The stock market crashed there for a while. Taxpayers received a bailout. For the first time in history, oil was trading at negative prices. And we just now made it through the first 4 months. So who knows what the rest of this year is going to bring. So where would we turn in the Bible to find guidance for times like these? I've been reading recently for the past few weeks about the life of Moses. Now you may be wondering, what does a Middle Eastern man, a Hebrew who lived well over 3,000 years ago, what does his life have to do with me and my circumstances? And the answer is quite a bit, because Moses was a man who lived almost his entire life in crisis. Now in just a moment I'm going to read a passage from Exodus chapter 3 from the life of Moses, but before I do, let me give you just a recap, remind you of some of the highlights of the life of Moses up to the point where we are going to read today. Now, even though Moses was a Hebrew, he was actually born in Egypt. As the book of Genesis ends, all of the descendants of Abraham through Jacob and the 12 sons of Jacob, they had all resettled in Egypt because there had been a great famine and drought in Canaan where they were living. So by the time that the book of Exodus opens, there's a 300-year gap between the close of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. So the Hebrews have been living there for hundreds of years, but they're not just living there. By the time the book of Exodus opens, they are slaves in the land of Egypt. There were so many Hebrews living in Egypt at the time that Moses was born that the Pharaoh and his advisors actually became worried about their vast numbers. They saw the Hebrews as a security threat, that they might rise up and lead a rebellion against the Pharaoh. And so the Pharaoh ordered that all the male children among the Hebrews should be killed. Now Moses was just an infant at the time, and his mother knew that if she kept him at home, he would be murdered. So she faced a terrible choice of what to do. And in the providence of God, she decided to take her infant son down to the Nile River, and she put him in a basket and set the basket adrift in the hopes that someone would find him and raise him. Also in the providence of God, Moses was found by the daughter of the Pharaoh. And she decided to raise the child as her own. And so Moses spent the first 40 years of his life as the adopted grandson of the Pharaoh. He lived a life of luxury and some power. But Moses never lost that connection to his own people. He was being raised as the Pharaoh's grandson, but he always knew that he was a Hebrew, and he felt a connection to those people. In the book of Exodus tells us that one day, as Moses was outside watching the Hebrew people doing their toil and labor as slaves to the Egyptians, he saw an Egyptian soldier beating one of the Hebrews. And in a fit of anger, Moses killed the Egyptian soldier. He did his best to hide the crime. He buried the soldier in the sand. But the very next day he was found out. And when the Pharaoh learned that Moses had killed one of his soldiers, he decided to kill Moses. And so Moses had to flee for his life. And he fled to a land called Midian. It was some 250 miles away from Egypt. And remember, this is back in the days before rapid transportation. Moses would have covered those 250 miles either on foot or on the back of a camel. When he got to Midian, he sat down by a well. And you see the hand of God at work in all of this. While he was there, an influential man in Midian came to get water for his flocks. This man of Midian, Jethro was his name, he was a priest there. Moses ends up marrying one of his 7 daughters. And after that, his new father-in-law gives him a job as an assistant shepherd. And so Moses would spend the next 40 years of his life in the backside of the desert, tending the flocks of another man. Talk about going from rags to riches, or riches to rags in this case. And that's where we find Moses today in the story I'm going to read from Exodus chapter 3. This is about the 2/3 of the way through the life of Moses. And one day while he's out in the desert watching his father-in-law's flock, we read this. This is beginning in Exodus chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert, and he came to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. There an angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "Here I am." God said to him, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." And then God said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And at this Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the land of Egypt and to bring them up out of that land into a land that is flowing with milk and honey, a land that is good and spacious." And so God said to Moses, "Go now. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" And God said, "I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your father has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am sent me." Here are 4 spiritual lessons that Moses learned in a crisis, and these are lessons for us today as well. The first one is in verses 4 through 7, and it's that God hears the prayers and the cries of his people. When God begins to speak to Moses, he tells him in verse 6, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, that's important. It sounds at first like he's just giving Moses a history lesson, but that's not what is going on here. He's reminding Moses that God keeps his word. God keeps his promises. And the promises that he made to Moses' ancestors hundreds of years ago, he's telling Moses those promises are still in effect. And then he says in verse 7, surely I have seen the affliction of my people and I have heard their cries. Now think of it. God's people had been enslaved in Egypt for hundreds of years. They felt abandoned. They felt let down. They felt forsaken. They had prayed for deliverance for years and years and years, yet no answer had ever come. Now locked away in your house, cut off from the contact of your fellow Christians, your church members, from family, from your normal activities, you may feel that way too. Abandoned, deserted, let down. Remember what was going on here in the life of Moses at the time. He had just spent 40 years in the backside of the desert watching another man's flock. He was so far out in the wilderness that the locals referred to the mountain that was nearby. They called it in Hebrew Mount Horeb, which in Hebrew means the Mount of Desolation. Don't you imagine that Moses also felt abandoned by God and forgotten by God? But I want you to notice something. It's in verse 4 of the passage we just read. God didn't have to consult MapQuest to find out where Moses was. He didn't need to get on Google Maps to locate him. God knew exactly where Moses was, even though he just spent 40 years hiding in a desert. God knew exactly where Moses was. He knew who Moses was. When he calls out to him, he doesn't say, hey, shepherd, or hey, you. He calls him by name. He does it twice. So Moses will be sure that God is speaking to him. And so just as God saw Moses and his circumstance, God sees yours as well. God knows what you are going through right now. That's the first lesson. Here's the second one. That's in verse 8. God acts on behalf of his people. Look at verse 8. I have come down to deliver them. While the Hebrews were toiling away in captivity, God was making plans to rescue them. I know they had waited a long time for an answer. And I also know that sometimes when we pray and call out to God for help, he answers instantaneously. And often he doesn't. Often it takes a long time for God's answer to be apparent. I don't know why that is. I do know that God is never in a hurry, and I know that he's always right on time. And the Hebrew people were about to see what God can do when he answers our prayers. But first, God had a surprise for Moses. And Moses was about to learn that God can do extraordinary things through ordinary people. And that was the third spiritual lesson that Moses learned. God hears the cries of his people. God acts on behalf of his people. And number 3, God can do extraordinary things through ordinary people. Look in verse 10. God says to Moses, you go tell the Pharaoh to let my people go. God chose Moses for that. He was going to use Moses as the instrument of his plan. God often does that, doesn't he? He uses the generosity of one person to help another person who is in need. He uses the encouraging words of one person to lift up another person who is down. He uses the kindness of one person to help another person who is suffering. Because God does extraordinary things through ordinary people like you and me. Now you may be thinking, well, Moses was anything but ordinary. After all, he's the one who received the 10 Commandments. He's the one who led Israel on the exodus out of Egypt. He's the one who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, but all of that was late. At this point in his life, Moses had been a failure at almost everything. Here he is, 2/3 of the way through his life. He has a low-paying job. We find out in the next chapter when God tells him he wants him to speak to Pharaoh that Moses says, well, I can't do that. I stutter when I speak. Even when he killed a man and tried to hide the crime, he failed at that. He's at the 2/3 mark of his life. He's been a failure for most of it. Moses spent the first third of his life thinking he was a somebody living in the palace. He spent the next third of his life out in the backside of a desert thinking he was a nobody. But he was about to find out what God can do with a somebody who thinks he's a nobody when that person follows God's plan. And that's when Moses learns the final lesson for today. It's in verses 11 through 14. And that is that God is with us in our trials. Verse 11, Moses tells God he does not feel up to the task. He says, who am I? And with good reason. Who was he to speak to the Pharaoh? The Egyptians considered the Pharaoh to be a divine being. And who was he to speak to the Israelites? Remember, he spent the first 40 years of his life living in the Pharaoh's palace. They hardly identified, the Israelites hardly identified with Moses. And he just spent the most recent 40 years living in the wilderness. So he hardly knew these people. So he asks God, who am I to do this? And he asks God his name. Who should I say sent me? Who are you? Now, we live in a time today when names have little significance most often. But in biblical times, names had great significance. Names were given to indicate someone's character. If you knew a person's name, you knew who they were at their core. And so when Moses asks God, what is your name? What he's really asking him is, who are you at your core? What is your character? And are you really up to this task? And in verse 14, for the first and only time in the Bible, God tells us what his name is. He tells us that his name is I am. Tell them, I am sent me. Now you may be wondering, what kind of a name is that? I am comes from the Hebrew word for existence. In a sense, God's name means to exist, but it's deeper than that and more profound than that. The idea is of the one being in the universe who is in complete and total control of all circumstances. The one being in the universe who has within himself complete and total self-sufficiency. And that's what he says to Moses. Tell them, I am sent me. But in a sense, what he's really telling Moses, he's not just telling Moses his name. What he's really saying to Moses is, Moses, this isn't about you. This is about me. And this answer, I am sent me, or I am is with me, would be the answer for every trial that Moses faced. It would be the answer to every question that Moses asked. When Moses said, I can't do it because I'm just a shepherd, the answer was, I am with you. When Moses said, I can't do it because I stutter when I speak, God said, I am with you. And this would be the answer for the future as well. When you stand before the Pharaoh, I am with you. When you cross over the Red Sea on dry land, I am with you. When your own people rise up and murmur against you, I am with you. When the people are hungry and need something to eat, I am with you. When there are giants in the land, I am with you. And then in verse 12, God calls Moses' attention to the mountain nearby. This is Mount Horeb. Mount Horeb has another name in the Bible. It's also known as Mount Sinai. You probably know that mountain because you'll remember that it was on Mount Sinai that Moses received the Ten Commandments from God's own hands. And he directs Moses' attention to the mountain. And in effect, he's saying to Moses, you don't understand this now. But one day in the future, you're coming back here. And you're going to worship me on that mountain. And when you do, you're going to look back and remember what I said to you. And then you're going to know that I was with you. After the plagues have brought their destruction, after the shadow of the death angel has passed, after the Red Sea has been crossed, after the murmuring of the people has ceased, after their hunger has been filled, you will look back to this moment and remember the promise that I made to you, and you will know that I was with you. There is a message of hope in that today for all of us. You may not understand everything that you're going through right now, and how could you? Who could understand all of this? It's unprecedented in our lifetime. However, we have the assurance from God that He is with us in our trials. And because you have that assurance from God's own word, you know that you can face the trials of today and you can trust God with your future. And so here are the lessons that Moses learned in a crisis. God hears our cries and our prayers. God is already working on our behalf even when we don't see it. Sometimes God chooses us to be the instrument of His answer. And God is with you in every struggle that you face. Been a joy to share this message with you today. I look forward to being with you again next week. Until then, may God bless and keep you.